Today on the Writing Coach podcast, I have Phillip L. Wray. Philip, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So today's a very exciting day. Your debut novel launched literally today.
Yeah, it's been kind of a whirlwind day, but it seems to have come together all right.
So the book is The PONTCOURT Murders. It is a historical murder mystery musketeer adventure mashup. How did this all start for you? When did you decide to write this book?
Well, I started writing beginning of January of last year, so 2021. But it sort of had its genesis during a trip to France back in 2019. And if you've ever been to Paris, they have a tour for everything there, from perfumes to Hemingway sites to whatever. And I've always loved Three Musketeers, Alexander Dumas stories. And a lot of that took place in Paris. So I thought, well, we'll find a Three Musketeers tour. But they didn't have one, which surprised me because I started researching. And a lot of the places mentioned in the book are still in existence. And then the actual places where some of the real historical characters lived or were also are in existence. So I thought, well, there's a gap there. I could put together a tour maybe and start trying to sell that or work with a tour company. And I had the maps, I did the research, I had the walking tour. I've still got it, kind of a script for it, and as well as where the tour would go. Had it all trimmed just to be the right length. And then COVID hit and sort of derailed all those plans. So I was left with stacks and stacks of research on the Three Musketeers, on the books, that time frame in Paris, and needed to do something with it. So why
I
not?
can honestly say you're the first person I've ever viewed whose novel started out as a tour.
Yeah, it was a walking tour that maybe someday I'll get to give. But now it's, I thought I've always loved mysteries, and there were some quirks about the history with the Three Musketeers. That was a very Protestants had been given a lot of rights under the previous king, but they were slowly being taken away. And you pretty much had to be a good Catholic, or at least a Catholic, to advance in society at this time. But at least two and maybe three of the actual musketeers that the Three Musketeers is based on were Protestant. And that started getting me thinking. Actually, one of the first things I thought of was, well, what would happen if there was this mix of religion, and how would that play out for a musketeer? And I started thinking, and you've probably remember this, that one of the first scenes I wrote was a musketeer falling in love with someone who was Jewish, and I was just curious how that would play out. And then I also had the idea for the mystery part, but that romance part kind of went by the wayside, and the mystery took over.
So you mentioned reading Dumas when you were young, Three Musketeers stuff. Is that what got you interested in France? Because I know you're from Texas. I don't. When someone thinks of an author from Texas, they probably don't think of a French expert. So did it all start with the Three Musketeers?
I think it probably started there, but when I got to college, I mean, I took French in high school, and when you got to college, I had to have 2 years or 4 semesters of French or a foreign language, so I stuck with French. And then by the time those 2 years rolled around, I didn't really want to stop and immediately forget everything, so I just kept taking French classes, and went to Paris during the summer with school, and took a couple classes over there. And that was really when I just completely fell in love, with France, and the language, the history, the everything.
What is it that attracts you to French culture?
I think it's just the history is fascinating. I mean, it had just phenomenal, great people in terms of influential people, whether good or bad. Napoleon, Louis the 14th, My personal favorite is good King Henry, who was Louis the 14th's grandfather. And they also had, I mean, they, for a good portion of the last several hundred years, they've been the center of a lot of culture, philosophical thought. I mean, you were painting. I mean, really, just about almost any part of society. They've been a leading light, and it just fascinates me. Plus, I mean, if you go to Paris, it's a huge city in terms of number of people, but it's very small. Geographically, you can walk a lot of it, and everywhere you go, you see something famous. And it's just fascinating to me.
They also have the history of political upheaval, right? From the French
Sure.
Revolution to students still protesting today.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that's sort of a joke over there. They talk about one of their national pastimes is going on strike, and I mean, it's just part of it. Whether it's the students going on strike, or the transit workers, someone's always going on strike about something. I think last time I was there, the farmers were going on strike, or at least had driven a bunch of tractors, I mean, hundreds of tractors into Paris and essentially paralyzed the city because they were upset. Frankly, can't remember what they were upset about, but it was. I'm sure it was that they weren't getting. I think they weren't getting enough pay for some of their crops.
So, as a published historical author now, what is your take on history? Clearly, it's something you've been interested in for a long time before maybe you were interested in writing, even. Do you see, when you look at history, do you say, oh, look at how far we've come? Or do you say, look how we're repeating the same mistakes all over again?
Oh, I guess it's a little of both. We definitely if you look back over enough time, you see repetition of things. You can look at some of the stuff just very obvious. Hitler's invasion of Russia. Well, that kind of modeled or followed with what happened to Napoleon's Grand Army invasion of Russia, which I think before that, I can't remember if it was Frederick the Great, someone else had tried. And, you can look at some of these big things like that where a leader makes the exact same mistake someone did 100 years before, and, so you see that, but then you also see we have enough political upheaval going on now. It's a little more genteel than the terror in France when they executed the nobility and the priests and everything, but you still get a lot of some of the same undercurrents there. So I don't know. I mean, it's to me, it's kind of fascinating to look at.
So you're obviously interested in history. You did this work for this tour. COVID happens. You decide to write a book. Did you always know it was going to be a murder mystery? Because we've talked a lot about your interest in history and in France and in Musketeers, but where does the murder mystery aspect come into it?
Well, I always loved, of course, Sherlock Holmes, and probably more so Agatha Christie. I think my writing's a little closer to how she would write and structure stories. Not that I would even think about comparing myself to her, but it's kind of that traditional mystery genre. And I've always, like I said, I've always enjoyed them, and I was just trying to think of something I could do with all this historical research, something that was a little different. I mean, I didn't want to just write another, action, war story, and I thought it would be more interesting to kind of meld my sort of passion for the mysteries with the musketeer and musketeer. I don't know, affinity, and see what came out of it.
So we've got the classical Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie mystery genre, and we have Dumas in the Musketeer stories. Were there other influences, either literary or historical, that went into the PONTCOURT murders?
Those were the main things. I did look and I've got some sequels, or probably not sequels, other books in the series in the works that are a little more grounded in actual historical events. So the first one was a little more of a kind of a backstory, just to introduce the primary character who's going to continue on through the rest of the stories. The other stories pick up some of the other events that were going on at the time. There's a great book called Blood Work that involves kind of the fight between the doctors over whether you could do transfusions and how you could do them, and some of the philosophical ideas like, well, does that affect your humanity if you transfuse from an animal to a human? And they were struggling with some pretty deep concepts at the time, and that's some of that pops up in a later book, to an extent. And there was also a series of murders in the reign of Louis XIV involving the nobility, and that also crops up in another book. That's like the Affair of the Poisons and Blood Work. They're both by an author named Holly Tucker, who's just phenomenal.
So your background is in law. Did your law experience in law play into the writing of the novel?
I think it does in some of maybe the structure of it. It's, the character is having to investigate, even though he's not a police investigator, not a a gendarme or anything. And I think there's a certain amount of maybe my training that kind of bled over into that. I'm used to having to question people, try to figure out what happened in a case. So, and I think that tends to be where I'm a little stronger in my writing, is when I'm, interviewing suspects. I'm not so good on description and some of that. I'm better at on the actual interrogation parts of the book.
Well, how about your experience playing into actually just getting words on a page? Because I have this experience, I've had a lot of success with doctor clients and with lawyer clients. Like, clearly doctors and lawyers are smart people, but I feel like there's some sort of work ethic that comes along with these sorts of careers, perhaps, that transitions over really nicely into novel writing. Would you agree?
Yeah. I think so. And you can just look at all the people who've had legal training and they've written, like Terry Brooks, who writes a lot of the fantasy, the Shannara books. And he could just churn out these voluminous books. But in most areas of the law, you've got pretty tight deadlines. You can get extensions, but for the most part, you've got to get the work done when it's due. And it doesn't matter if you're not feeling well or you're bored or, it's uninteresting work. You just have to fight through it. And so there's a certain amount of that. I think that also tends to make you write quicker. And probably one of the things that I struggle with is it also makes you write pretty lean. You try to just, here's the fact, fact 1, 2, 3, which doesn't necessarily translate well to a novel. It might help you speed through it a little more, but it definitely makes it a little bit thin at times.
So did you have any fiction writing background prior to the novel?
Not really. I actually, and I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but I did write something in high school that was more fantasy related, and I've still got it somewhere. I'm terrified to go look at it now because I'm sure it's just horrendous. But really, that was it. Once you get out in the working world and have family and everything, you just start, you don't have quite as much time. So, that sort of went by the wayside.
So with limited fiction writing experience, what was the process of sitting down and writing the first draft of this book? How did you go about it?
Well, I had the idea, of the killing or killings, and I sort of knew who the killer would be, and I just had the general idea for the story, and really didn't know anything about kind of the rules of like structure of the story or the pacing. So I just really just wrote it, and I forget. I think the first draft, which I thought was huge, was like 37,000 words. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is it. This is a book. And then, you know, then I started learning about actually how to structure a story, the genres, and what's expected, and kind of came to realize that my book was not all that at the beginning. So that's really how I got started. So I had this 37,000 word thing, novella, maybe, I don't know what you would even call it, and just wasn't sure what to do with it from that point. So.
And is that what led you to working with me?
Yeah, so I had followed an editor on LinkedIn, and just would see her, occasional comments, and it would be, some of it was kind of big picture stuff on story structure, and some of it was like, how do you use an Oxford comma, how does this, so it could be anything. So I just sent her a message one day and said, I've got this, I don't know what to do with it. I don't even know, I had no concept of what steps to take. And she, so she asked me a few questions. I told her, how I had gotten there. And she said probably needed a writing coach, and to make sure I learned kind of the craft part of it and kind of put my story into the right shape. And that's how I found you. And then we plowed through it.
We certainly did. And you are probably one of the quickest learners I've ever worked with. You're an extremely productive writer, but also, I'd tell you how to properly use an Oxford comma once, and then you'd use it properly from then on. Do you have any sense of, have you always been a quick learner, or how were you able to, I saw you progressing week to week at an extraordinary pace in terms of learning these fundamentals, but then also executing on them.
I think that probably to some extent goes back to the legal training, because you can. I do it. You can make the same mistake over and over, but at some point your clients are not going to be happy with it. Your bosses aren't going to be happy. So you just have to learn whatever it is, whatever particular thing you're doing, you've got to cut down on the mistakes. So I think that's part of it. And as a lawyer, I think just about any kind of law, you have to read a lot, and a lot of it's pretty dry material, but you have to assimilate a lot of information. And so, that I think that helps. Maybe I wouldn't want to say focus more, but I tend to retain more information, I think. So.
What was the biggest challenge you encountered in the writing process of the book, and how did you overcome it?
Well, I think my ignorance at the beginning was one of the main things, because I thought, 37,000 words, that's a lot. And I think one of the first things you asked is like, what? I think it was the end of January of 2021, and you said, well, how long do you think, or how long do you expect this process to take? I was like, I think we can have this done by March, just because I had no idea what I was doing or what I was dealing with in the process. So that was certainly a challenge, just to figure some of the nuts and bolts stuff out, aside from learning how to structure a story. And I think the other thing is, like I mentioned earlier, is the tending to write lawyerly. And sometimes you do that all day, then I get a switch and try to do a description of a scene, and I sort of default back to the very dry writing, very, very thin, very little description. And I have to work to not do that.
Well, as someone who's edited your work and many people's work, I always say there's basically two ends of the spectrum. It's either you have way too many words or you write super lean, and very few people are actually in the middle. But on the lean side, the benefit of writing lean is clarity. Like you said, you're falling into lawyer mode, but what you mean by lawyer mode is being super, super clear about what's going on. So I think that's a great starting point for a first draft, or any draft, is at least we know what you're trying to communicate as an author, and then we can build on that. We can add the meat and really flesh out details, but the core of what you're trying to communicate to the reader is there, and I think that's great.
Now, that's a fair assessment, but it still is a struggle where the editor will come back and say, you described everyone in this story as having brown hair. What do you mean by brown? They can't all be exact. I'm like, well, it's different kinds of brown, but it's just brown. It's like, okay, we gotta work on that. So it's, that I think that's probably one of my bigger challenges.
How did you grapple with the historical detail?
You know, some of it was just the research I'd already done, but there were things that, and I've done a lot of reading just over the years on the history of Paris, whether it's the art or the city or whatever architecture. But there were still things that just slipped by me every now and then, and you just fall into that trap. Like I think in the first book at one point I had referred to them being on the left bank. Well, they didn't call it the left bank for another couple hundred years, but so I just tried to double check a lot of that stuff. And if it was something there's some things you could take a little bit of license with. I can't tell you exactly how long this street is because they've redone the streets or they've cut through neighborhoods. So you can say it's X distance and there's not really anyone that tells you you're wrong. But if it's a historical fact that is discoverable, then it's, I just tried to nail it down before I made an assertion. I want to make sure, for instance, the types of weapons that they had that particular weapon at that year. It didn't, I'd hate to write it and then have it find out it didn't come into existence for a couple more years. You can find books on just about anything. Because I wanted to make the meals, for instance, I wanted to be historically accurate. Well, as much as research that I'd done, I didn't know what they ate at that time. I'd never thought about it. So I found a French cookbook from like the 1650s. And I'm like, okay. And it tells you what you serve with what. I'm like, okay, we're going with that. If I need to have a meal and it's, a fancy meal, I'm just going to lift it from that cookbook.
What was your favorite part about the writing process?
I think I just thought it was fun. I thought it was fun to make progress on it. There were the times where it was sort of frustrating where you think, I don't know how I can add to this, or I don't know, or this is how I've viewed it. Now I've got to completely undo that section, so that, there would be the frustration, but as the story took shape, it was just fun. It was a kind of story that I would like to read. So hopefully someone else will, but I just enjoyed seeing the story kind of roll out.
That's certainly one of the benefits of my job as well. I just love seeing authors like yourself grow and develop and take, say, this first book, which was a little rough around the edges, as you said at the beginning, and just see it grow and iterate and become the great book that it is today that's now being published. It's like watching your children grow on fast forward, it's so great to see something go from, idea or rough piece of story into a great book that people can now, as of today, go to Amazon and purchase.
Yeah, it's fun. And now, hopefully the second one be out in 3 months or so and just kind of keep going from there.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about that. Certainly we want people to go and pick up this first book right away. So everyone head on over to Amazon or to my website. I'll have links to Phil's book there. But you're going to have a sequel hot on its heels.
Yeah, well, that's what everyone says is really the only way to even potentially make money is to have a series, to have enough books that they can sort of grow, together, feed into each other. So, and I was lucky, guys. I had an idea for the second book as I was finishing up the first. And so while I was going through the editing process, the first book, that is, I went ahead and started on the second and, went from there around. So
Right. I mean, that's the thing about so many people spend so much time on a first book is because you're writing a book and you're learning to write a book at the same time. And once you finish that book, now it's like you've been through the process, you understand the steps. You still have to do them all, but you can go through them so much swifter because you're not learning and executing, you're just executing. Though, of course, we're always learning as well as we go, but for the most part, you know what you're doing.
well, I knew, yeah, and some of it was the nuts and bolts stuff, like um, I don't know if you put the showing and not telling or part in there as nuts and bolts, but knowing just how to write dialogue where it's paced properly, things like that, where you then are not having to go back and fix that. You've got it down. You might need to tweak the dialogue, but at least you're not having to also move commas and things like that. So the process starts getting a lot faster. So yeah, and the third one then was much faster. I'm seeing the time frame of writing starting to compress more, which is nice.
Yeah, well, as I said, you're incredibly productive, so I love that.
Well, it's it's a nice hobby. Now I got to turn it into a business maybe.
Absolutely. All right, so Phil, who is the Poncourt Murders for? Who should pick up this book?
So if you like those old Agatha Christie or The Thin Man, those kinds of stories, I think that's kind of the person that I'm shooting for. And if you like France or want to learn about, some of the kind of maybe more obscure stuff, like what did they eat, I mean, I think those people would find it interesting too.
Well, it's funny, the one you haven't mentioned is the kind of the group of people I consider myself in, which is I just love adventure stories. I love stories where people go out there and fight bad guys and have an adventure. And you certainly overlay that adventure tone over the murder mystery and the historical literature.
Yeah, that's, I think you said earlier, it's kind of a mashup between Three Musketeers and, a traditional mystery. I mean, I still, I guess I would put it in a genre as a traditional mystery, but I also wanted to keep the action in it. Otherwise, there would be no real reason to have a musketeer being the person investigating it. You could just have a clerk or someone who worked for the court doing it, or a gendarme or something. But I wanted that musketeer aspect. So got to have some sword fighting, maybe a gunfight here or there.
Horse chase.
Yeah. Well, yeah. My horse knowledge is still a little lacking, but I'm getting there.
Well, Phil, the book was published today. Congratulations. I'm so thrilled to see it out there in the world. What's up in terms of book promotion? Oh, you mentioned you have the sequel coming out in 3 months. I assume you're incredibly busy with that already. But for now, what have you got coming up in the next month or two in terms of PONTCOURT Murders?
Well, gonna do a couple of signings, getting those organized. I need to do more of these types of things, however painful they may be, and then I've been for the last week, it's probably 2 weeks, I've been contacting pretty much everyone in my network of lawyers and friends, just out and about, kind of letting them know this was in the works. A few people I had told, what was going on throughout the process. But a lot of people didn't know I was writing anything. So I wanted to give them a heads up. And then in the last day or two, I've been saying, okay, it's going to be released, or, whatever they call it, going live on Amazon imminently. So get ready. And then today I'm following up, sending them the links and everything. So it's just, I haven't really thought a whole lot beyond that, but at least I know I'm going to have a signing in October, probably 2 different ones. So we'll see.
Excellent. Well, the book is The PONTCOURT Murders. Head on over to Amazon today and pick it up. Phil, any final comments for the folks out there?
Now, I just really appreciate all your help in getting this book across the finish line, and editors, and I mean, there was just my ignorance in how to write was one thing. The process of actually getting a book published, that was a whole nother animal. So yeah, I'd highly recommend using you to make that process go smoother.
Well, Phil, it was such a pleasure working with you and continuing to work with you. And congratulations on the book launch.
All right. Thank you very much.